There was a moment somewhere in the middle of 1985 when the music industry quietly held its breath. Nobody talked about it out loud. That's not how the industry worked. But everyone felt it. The rules were about to change. And the woman who had written most of those rules was about to feel the ground move beneath her feet. Her name was Ella Fitzgerald, and for 40 years that name had meant one thing: the ceiling. She was the standard, the benchmark, the first lady of song, not just by reputation, but by the absolute, unquestioned agreement of every serious musician alive. Frank Sinatra called her the greatest. Duke Ellington composed for her specifically. Critics who disagreed on everything else agreed on Ella. You didn't argue with her, you sat down and you listened. So when Whitney Houston's debut album landed in the spring of 1985, the jazz world's reaction was something close to indifference. Not hostility, just distance. Pop music was pop music. Whitney was young, beautiful, commercially backed by Arista Records and Clive Davis, which in those circles was practically a mark against her. She hadn't paid dues in clubs, hadn't spent years grinding through session work. She had walked out of Newark, New Jersey, with a voice that could shatter glass, and the industry handed her a spotlight before she fully understood its weight. Ella's people weren't threatened. They were simply unimpressed. But here's the thing about indifference. It only holds until it doesn't. If this story is pulling you in, hit subscribe. Stories like this drop here every week. The event was a music industry gala in New York City, late 1985. The kind of room where you could turn in any direction and collide with someone whose name appeared on albums you owned. Labels had tables. Managers moved between conversations. The air smelled like money and ambition, and the cologne of men who had been powerful long enough to wear it comfortably. Ella Fitzgerald was there because she was always there. She didn't need to promote anything. Her presence was the statement. She moved through rooms like this the way that monuments move through cities. They don't move at all, but everything else arranges itself around them. Whitney Houston was there as a newcomer. Newly famous, newly signed, still learning the social codes of a world that had existed long before she arrived. She knew who Ella was. Every black girl who had grown up singing in a church choir in New Jersey knew that name. You didn't need to be a jazz fan, you just needed ears and a grandmother. The encounter in the corridor happened the way important things often happen. Without announcement, without ceremony, almost by accident. Whitney was walking toward backstage when Ella stepped out of a side door. The two women found themselves face to face in a narrow hallway with nowhere to go. Ella's assistant was with her. Whitney was alone. "What kind of music do you do, honey?" Ella asked. The question was polite. The tone was pleasant. But underneath both, if you knew how to listen, there was a boundary being drawn, a category being assigned. Ella wasn't being cruel. She was being precise. She had spent 40 years in a world where the categories mattered, where jazz was serious and pop was entertainment, and where everyone understood which side of that line they were standing on. Whitney looked at her for a moment, then she said simply, "I sing, not I do pop. Not I'm Whitney Houston, I just signed with Arista. Not an explanation, not a resume, not an apology. Just, I sing." Ella smiled at that, nodded once, said something gracious, and moved on. And that, as far as anyone watching was concerned, was the end of it. But what nobody could have predicted was what happened 2 hours later. The sound check for Whitney's performance was scheduled for a time when most of the room's important people were at dinner. That was intentional. Sound checks are workmanlike things, technical and unglamorous, not meant for an audience. An artist walks out, sings into a microphone. The engineers adjust the levels. She sings again. They give a thumbs up. She leaves. It is not a performance. It is maintenance. Ella Fitzgerald was not supposed to be in the room. She had finished her dinner early. Her assistant was handling something. She took a wrong turn looking for the green room, or maybe she heard something drifting down the hall. Nobody is entirely sure of the mechanics. What is certain is that she ended up standing at the back of the rehearsal space just as Whitney Houston stepped up to the microphone. Whitney didn't know anyone was watching. That part matters, because what happened next was not a performance. It was Whitney alone with a microphone and a sound engineer, running through a song the way she had run through it 1,000 times. In church basements, in high school auditoriums, in her mother Sissy's living room. She was warming up her voice the way you warm up a car engine on a cold morning. Not to go anywhere yet, just to make sure everything was still working. She started to sing, and Ella Fitzgerald, the first lady of song, the woman who had been the ceiling for 40 years, stopped walking. Stopped mid-step. Just stopped. The engineer at the board didn't even look up. He was watching his levels, adjusting his faders. But if he had looked up, he would have seen Ella standing at the back of the room with her hand resting against the wall, as if she needed something solid to hold on to. Because what Ella was hearing was not a pop singer running scales. What she was hearing was a voice that did not seem to have edges. Most singers, even great ones, have a ceiling. A place where the voice gets thin or strained or loses its color. You can hear it if you know what to listen for. It's like the moment when a road runs out of pavement. The smoothness just ends. Every singer has that place. The great ones push it further than the rest, but it is always there. Whitney's didn't seem to be there. She moved through the register the way water moves, without effort, without hesitation, with a gravity-defying inevitability that made the whole thing feel less like a demonstration of skill and more like a natural law being stated plainly. And the emotion underneath the technique, that was the thing Ella hadn't expected. This wasn't a method deployed in service of a song. This was a woman whose instrument and soul had fused into something indistinguishable. When Whitney sang, she wasn't controlling the feeling. She simply was the feeling. The sound check lasted maybe 6 minutes. Then it was over. Whitney said something to the engineer, got a thumbs up, and walked off the stage without looking back. She had no idea anyone had been watching. Ella stood at the back of the empty room for a little while after that. Her assistant found her there a few minutes later and asked if everything was all right. Ella said yes, she was fine. But those who knew her well said she was different for the rest of that evening. Not upset, not threatened. Something far more complicated. Something that looked, from a certain angle, like the specific peace that settles over a person when a question they've been carrying finally receives its answer. The thing about holding a title for 40 years is that you know, somewhere deep and honest inside yourself, that you are holding it on behalf of something larger than you. Ella hadn't given herself the name First Lady of Song. That name had been given to her because she represented a standard the whole art form was reaching for. And part of carrying that standard was knowing that one day someone would carry it forward in a way you simply could not. Not as a replacement, not as a threat, as a continuation of something sacred. That night, in the green room before her own performance, Ella sat with a glass of water and said almost nothing. She was watching the wall, thinking about something nobody else in that room could see. What came after that evening is where the story gets heavier. The two women didn't build a close relationship. They occupied different worlds, even as those worlds slowly orbited closer through the late 1980s and into the 90s. Whitney became exactly what everyone had said she would become. One of the best-selling artists in history, the voice of a generation, the benchmark against which every other female vocalist was now measured. And Ella's health had begun its long, slow decline. Diabetes had taken her vision in one eye, then the other. By the mid-1990s, she was making almost no public appearances. The world was losing access to her in increments. But in 1996, a journalist who had known Ella for years managed to sit with her briefly. They talked about music, about how much had changed. At some point, Whitney Houston's name entered the conversation. Ella paused. The journalist waited, and then Ella said 5 words. "She is better than me," said quietly, without drama, without the kind of theatrical generosity that people sometimes perform when a camera is running. Just a flat, clean statement of fact, offered the way you'd offer someone the time of day. She didn't elaborate. She didn't qualify it. She said what she believed, and then she moved on. The journalist, caught off guard, didn't push. The full interview was never published. That specific exchange surfaced years later, passed through the hands of people close to Ella, carrying the weight of something said precisely because it was never supposed to be heard. Ella Fitzgerald died in June of 1996. She was 79 years old. She never said those words publicly. She never called Whitney and told her. She never made a moment of it, but she said them in a quiet room to one person with no audience and no applause. And that is somehow the most Ella thing about the whole story. Here is what makes that moment worth carrying around. Ella didn't have to say it. There was nothing to gain, no legacy to protect, no rivalry to resolve. She said it because it was true, and because she had spent 79 years building her life on the truth of music. You don't spend that long in honest service to something and then lie about it at the end. Whitney Houston never knew. Nobody thought to deliver those words while they would have meant the world to her. The corridor in 1985, the sound check nobody arranged for Ella to witness, 5 words that never reached their destination. And yet, maybe what moves you about this story isn't the tragedy of words never delivered. Maybe it's the image of Ella Fitzgerald, vision failing, the world going quiet around her, standing at the back of a room listening to a younger woman sing, not judging, not measuring, just listening and understanding with a clarity that only comes at a certain age, that greatness is not a trophy you hold. It is a river you join. And sometimes the most honest thing you can do is step aside and watch the current carry someone further than you ever went. 2 women, the same gift, offered to the world at different times. One corridor, one sound check that wasn't meant to be heard by anyone but an engineer adjusting his levels on a Tuesday evening in New York City. And somewhere in all of that, in 6 minutes of warm-up singing that permanently changed what Ella Fitzgerald believed about the limits of the human voice, is the whole complicated, beautiful, heartbreaking truth about what it means to be the best at something. You don't get to stay there forever, but if you are Ella Fitzgerald, you get to recognize the moment it passes. And you get to carry that recognition quietly, honestly, all the way to the end. Have you ever witnessed something so extraordinary that it permanently shifted what you thought was possible? Tell us about it in the comments below. We read every single one.